I pull this direct from 3710 so to ensure I'm hitting the current and latest and greatest gouge on what we're supposed to be covering. And kind of go from there. Let me click over. There we go. All right, so really for class 4 guys like you guys, so Bell Chase and the C-12s, Andrews in your little jets, there's really only 4 primary topics to hit on. Spatial D, talk about hypoxia, limited ALSS, but that's why I was hoping mics were on so you guys could give me feedback about RAFs and radios that you'll carry, and then we'll tap dance over laser data. So biggest thing with spatial orientation or spatial disorientation is I've got technically 5 senses, but I can guarantee you taste isn't telling you where you are in the world, except in terms of orientation wise. But the other 4 senses are giving me a fair amount. Eyes being the strongest, followed by vestibular, and then I would say somatosensory. Auditory generally isn't telling you where you're at, but I would argue it gives you an immense amount of situational awareness, how the aircraft sounds, or flaps down or up, just that air slipstream, the airstream noise going over the aircraft, how the engines are turning, is left or right, or you getting that weird feedback of mismatch, especially more so in the C-12. And once I get all that data in, brain processes. Provided everything agrees, I'm oriented. If they disagree, I am dealing with an illusion. Now, just because I'm dealing with it doesn't mean I don't know how to handle it, because that's where, if I'm handling it, I can rely on instruments, other things to back up the sense that is creating the shortfall and get me reoriented. The problem is when I don't recognize the illusion with those mismatched inputs, that's when I'm actually disoriented. And then it's a matter of, can I fight through it, use the instruments to get back, or am I completely out to lunch and struggling from there? So generally speaking, we orient to the world around us with our eyes first, and we will generally use the horizon as our primary cue of, am I turning, am I climbing, am I descending, all that. Whether we realize it or not, for the pilots up front especially, they will orient the primary cue of that horizon to something on the aircraft once you've gotten accustomed to that airframe that will give you the warm fuzzy that you are straight and level. It is different for every single person because of how your personal height, how you arrange the seat. Are you sitting left seat, right seat this particular flight? All that changes the picture, right? The sight picture. But once I've locked it in, I know I'm good, and deviations from that is when I get uncomfortable or the hair should stand up on my neck. So when does that happen and I get disoriented? Well, the first one's going to be degraded visual environment. 2 times that happens. Nighttime, because it's really generally harder to discern a good horizon, and or IMC. To where I can't actually see all the way to the ground. Thus, I then fall back on those other 3 senses, of which I can kind of rule out hearing, because that's not going to tell me the ground per se, unless I'm clipping treetops, in which case, yep, that's pretty good feedback, but 10,000, 20,000 feet, that's not helping me. Then I fall on, where does gravity tell me down is, but if you're in a 1G turn, that's unreliable. And then my semicircular canals in the ear, again, after about 10 to 15 seconds of steady state motion, those have reset, whether I've turned or not. So that is when I now have to go inside the cockpit, rely on those instruments. But if I have a high cockpit workload where I'm trying to process a lot of information, write down data from ATC, et cetera, that means my eyes aren't actually on the instruments and puts me in an even worse position. Poor mission planning and or briefing, if I'm not prepared for where I'm going to be or what's coming up at me, could set me up. Fatigue and or stress makes it harder for me to process what's going on. And then finally, the one that kind of worries me the most around reserves is not that you have a lack of experience. Most reservists, it's a boatload of experience. The problem comes up in currency of when was the last time they flew this airframe compared to whatever else they're coming from, realizing a fair number of individuals are flying other aircraft on their civilian side before they come in for their drill. So how much of a negative transfer might occur and sneak in on them in a pinch that they have to be cognizant of, brief to, talk about, have good plan within the crew, have those your crewmen in the back backing up instruments. Hopefully they are transferring also information from other airframes that could give a negative transfer as well. So that's why using resources available, because ultimately you're all have skin in the fight while you're in that airframe. And then the three types of spatial D, should they happen, one is the fat, dumb, and happy and don't realize they're in trouble, that unrecognized. Type 2 is recognized, you know you're disoriented, and you are able to fight through the disorientation to utilize the instruments and other resources to get you out of the disorientation and get you back to a zero-sum game, straight and level, whatever that may be, to keep you safe. Type 3 is incapacitating. You know you're disoriented, but you cannot figure your way out of it on your own. That's where you're pulling in outside resources to talk you through, to get out of that dive, to get out of that turn, what have you, where something else or someone else is directing you out of it to help you solve it. So a litany of illusions visually, you got that VMC IMC, nose level, false horizons, like the picture's a pretty good example of. You can kind of guess where it is, but you're not going to be dead on accurate. Another would be around mountainous terrain, having flown in C-12s out of Beaufort and Belle Chase quite a bit. Many times they've gone up kind of the northeast. I vaguely recall one airfield that it's just surrounded by mountains, that every time somebody flew up there, different crews had gone, and they would specifically brief about dealing with those horizons and the sight picture that particular airfield created for them. Excuse me. Black hole illusion generally had always been thought of as aircraft carrier, amphib created, but you can also get at austere airfields. Featureless terrain, getting that flow, lanes. You're dealing with ATC that's got you in kind of a holding pattern in steady turns and foul weather. Can that hit? And then G-axis as you're looking into or out of turns. So generally when I'm outside and I make those turns, my head is kind of locking the horizon and the aircraft is moving in relation to the horizon. But once I get inside the cockpit, now the aircraft doesn't feel like it's moving in relation to the horizon, and it takes a minute, generally speaking, for people to reorient to that attitude gyro to help them out. And if it's a sudden switch, that's when we'll get some control reversal errors that occur. Not often, but when they do, this is generally the situation that it'll happen. As they're making that quick transition, and sucker them into misunderstanding that attitude gyro. So that's why, especially in a two-seater, having somebody that goes on instruments early in preparation to back them up, the pilot that's on controls, or crewman in the back, getting up in the tunnel a little bit, kind of looking up from the back to back up those instruments and get that sight picture built for themselves to help back everybody up. So like I said, that fixed sight picture, but as soon as I get in that mountainous terrain, I don't have a good horizon anymore. So do I inadvertently pick a fixed point as my quote unquote horizon, get myself into trouble because I fix the sight picture? The gap from the top of that arrow to the bottom of the arrow, I maintain it, which, because it's a fixed point, vice a horizon constantly receding, will get you nose low, because normally it should drop through your field of view. But if you fixed it as that reference point, you end up nosing down and getting yourself in trouble. So, to that example earlier of that airfield that had gone to with a couple different crews, everybody made a point of pointing out you got to get the instruments early and pay attention to that airfield, because it's almost like a bowl of mountains around it that they had to be mindful of. And with Black Hole, realizing you guys could go out to airfields all over the place without surrounding city lights around, this mimics what an aircraft carrier will do to pilots and aircrew. Of you now fixate the airfield as your primary cue, whereas during the day it would be a secondary or a tertiary, cue that you would use, and you're just more so lining up the runway than actually fixating on it. And the problem is when I fixate on it as a primary cue, you lose altitude too early, you get slow too early. There's tree topping incidents with FedEx aircrew and aircraft. So being mindful of those airfields that are kind of out in the middle of nowhere without good cultural lighting around them to help you pick up a better primary cue to help you on that glide slope as you're approaching. So how do I avoid this? One, physically, how am I walking to this aircraft today? Am I well rested, ate well, hydrated well? Did I plan appropriately? Am I relying on my experience, but also being mindful of what's my currency like? Did you get a good weather brief, or is weather going as planned? Things like that you got to be mindful of. And then with the scan, 3 parts, you guys aren't really using NVGs, but instruments and your naked eye and that unaided. Scan the instruments, scan the surrounding area as best you can, especially as you're punching through weather. One individual staying true to the instruments with another backing up of when can I see the ground, following those NATOPS procedures to get you in. If somebody is disoriented, get them on instruments, fight to make the brain buy off, because how often have the instruments lied versus weather causing their brain to get tied up? Communicate both within the aircraft, whether you've got just the 2 up front, where you've got crew chief in the back, talking through with the TA in the back, get the aircraft level so that my proprioceptive resets after about 15 seconds. Keep in mind that your semicircular canals in your ear will reset, so I've got to bite that time and get through that, and now my eyes should be able to better fix and process, and brain better process what the instruments are telling me. Pull to the horizon as needed and use everything you've got available to you. Things that are going to work against your SA, I'm sure you've all had it at some point: distraction or an expectancy error. You think one thing's going to happen and so your brain just fills in the space despite it being inaccurate. Task overload or task fixation. You get a master caution go off in the aircraft. It's really easy to get fixated on solving it and forgetting to aviate and navigate. They're troubleshooting. Either anybody happen to have a experience yourselves, either Captain Martin or a corporal, of dealing with any of the degraders that kind of were an aha moment in an aircraft flight?
I think this is Captain Martin here. For degraders, the biggest thing is fatigue that I've seen over my experience with the helo background. Every visual illusion or SA degrader kind of had some aspect of fatigue with it as an underlying theme. And so each of those individual situations, we probably could have been on higher alert if during the brief, that fatigue had come out when talking about human factors and that sort of thing before we even walked to the aircraft.
Fair point. And actually, Safety Center notes it shows up in I think the stat is greater than 70% of the time. It's a contributing factor, at least, if not causal, in just about every report that comes through. Corporal, you were about to say something.
Negative, sir.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. With that, kicking on with everything makes sense for the most part for Spatial D. Good to go. All right. Nothing heard, so rolling. Hypoxia. Really, the fact that we're going up at altitude in these aircraft, anything above 10,000 feet, means we need help because we're there so transiently. The human body adapts to live above 10,000 feet, as proven throughout the world. The problem is they aren't getting there in a matter of a minute or two. They're taking some time to get there, and or they're living there for long periods of time to adapt. Problem is you don't have that luxury in the aircraft, so congrats, you take off and you're at 20,000 feet in a matter of 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on ATC control. And that isn't a good place to be. So what do we do to compensate for it? Well, I either pressurize the cabin and or I give you O2. In your aircraft, you're not breathing O2 the whole time, so the cabin pressurization solves the problem and keeps you below 10,000 feet. Now, when you lose cabin pressurization, that's why you have the masks that drop down or you have to pull out and put on to compensate and take care of you until you can get back below 10,000 feet and deal with whatever happened that caused the cabin depressurization. So there's 4 types of hypoxia, and generally whenever the term hypoxia is thrown out, hypoxic hypoxia is the one that comes to mind because everybody just thinks that's just the way we kind of are hardwired to think. And hypoxic hypoxia is the atmosphere around you doesn't possess enough oxygen to really support anything you're doing. Consequently, every breath I take isn't bringing in enough. I'm not getting enough across my lungs into the bloodstream, and it's not getting from the bloodstream to the tissue. And that's hypoxic hypoxia. That is the above 10,000 feet is when we start to struggle. Now, are there illnesses and other things that can degrade and technically lower the 10,000 feet for an individual for a given period of time? Sure. But by and large, we'll just assume 10 to make the math easy for everybody. Now, histotoxic hypoxia is the atmosphere was perfectly fine. My breathing is perfectly fine. It's the problem of binding into the bloodstream onto those red blood cells. Now, that's going to occur, off the blood cells into the tissue, jumping the gun a little bit. So histotoxic is O2 environment, O2 uptake, and O2 transport are fine. It's the tissue can't get it into the tissue once it's in proximity. That's usually when we're talking smoke and fumes in a cockpit, so the EPs from the NATOPs. Hypemic, also known as anemic hypoxia, is good O2 outside. The tissue could use it if it'll get there. It's the transport problem, so the middle part of the process is to blame here. You've either donated red blood cells or you're losing red blood cells, one of the two. So I can't transport as well. Or I've bound carbon monoxide to the red blood cells, which takes a fair chunk of time to clear off. And it's effectively blocking the ability to uptake O2 because it's sitting where O2 was supposed to be on the red blood cell. So that's why if you're around a busy flight line, depending on what platforms people came from in the past, lots of aircraft turning, lots of exhaust. That's why hypemic or anemic hypoxia was a bit more of a culprit or questionable source for what people were feeling. And then the last but not least, stagnant hypoxia. If blood's pooled in your feet, it doesn't do your brain a lot of good. And that doesn't necessarily require excessive G's to be a problem. Simply sitting for long periods of time does it. So I'm sure everybody has the experience of those long cross-country drives as you're moving duty stations, coming up on holidays, you're driving home to see family, and stereotypical guys will push it as far as we can before we get gas and or food, and you're getting a little groggy right before you finally tap out and either need the food, the bathroom break, or gas. And you notice when you first get out of the vehicle and start moving around, you pep up quite a bit. It's not excitement, it's that you've restored blood flow with that motion and movement and moving around. So you're reoxygenating the body a little more effectively. And that's why that you tend to perk up after that movement. Well, same thing occurs in the aircraft. You sit for long periods of time. You don't have a treadmill or bike with you to get the blood flowing. You're kind of trapped in your seat in a tight cockpit. You'll get stagnant hypoxia. So in that case, I'm less worried about you at takeoff. I'm now wondering, how are you performing come landing, which historically, what are the two most dangerous phases of flight? Takeoff and landing. And through stagnant hypoxia, I just put you at greater risk on the landing side of it. How long's this flight? Has stagnant hypoxia begun to creep in on you? So, signs and symptoms. Signs, everybody can see it if they'll just pay attention. I can see somebody hyperventilating or hear it over comms. You can guess poor judgment unless you're not real familiar with the person. So first flight or two, you may not have that essay of them. Are they kind of slouching? Elation, they're overly excited. Outright unconsciousness, but I'd hope you'd had a lot of signs prior to getting to that point. Symptoms are going to require somebody to fess up to you. You can't really see if they're having a hot and cold flash. Nausea until the point that they actually vomit, you're not going to know unless they're telling you about it. Numbness and or tingling, so all these kind of creep in on an individual to give you a warning. And continue to bring these up, because if you have a slow depressurization, these cues might be the first indicator that you're having a problem in the cockpit. Decompression sickness, because that decompression could become an issue, it's generally required to be over 18,000 feet to trigger it. Fluctuating pressurization, it has to be pretty dramatic fluctuations. What they learned with F-18s was the 3,000, maybe 5,000 foot swings that they were getting. Actually, the body responded to more as a TBI, concussive, than it did a decompression per se. You could also get with an overpressurization on the deck, but again, a couple thousand feet or more is required to trigger that. So there's ironically 4 types of manifestations of DCS, and talking about DCS or decompression sickness, I'm not, unless you have a decompression of the aircraft, I'm less panicked with you guys than I am the fact that you're transporting people. And what is their background? What are they walking to that aircraft with you? If it's all VIPs, you're talking 2-3 star individuals, colonels, they're going to and from meetings, odds on you're not dealing with people that went scuba diving and stuff. So put you guys in a little better position than some other transport airframes. So 4 types of manifestations, chokes being the worst, skin being rather benign. They'll confess to feeling like they've got ants crawling on their skin or kind of that tingling across the skin. Bends is going to be the joint pain, primarily the major ones, and then central nervous system. If you question whether it looks like somebody's having a stroke and you've had some pressure issues, you can consider DCS as a possible. So you're going to want to get low and get O2 on them as quickly as possible. Have them control their breathing for both primarily towards hypoxia, simply because your body was trying to compensate for the lack of O2. So generally, you will increase your respiratory rate. Now that I'm on 100% O2, I don't want to keep that respiratory rate up because now I'm off gassing CO2 too fast, which can cause other problems. So that's why you control the breathing, get them down below 10,000 feet to get some pressure back on them. With hypoxia, by the fact I'm below 10,000 feet, if the O2 ran out, I shouldn't need supplemental anymore anyways. So it helps solve some problems there. Double check the equipment, talk obviously, and get with the flight doc, let maintenance know what's going on, etc. If you guys have a hypoxic event, you technically need to report to the PE rapid response team. So it's going to be your DOS and me. And we'll work it from there. Can rule in or out whether it was an actual PE or not. Questions on hypoxia? Nothing heard, pressing on. So ALSS, congrats, you know how to wear a flight suit and boots. Per 3710, there are stars next to a vast number of these items. As long as you got your helmet, flight suit, or no helmet, excuse me. I was looking at boots and saying something else. So your boots, your flight suit, no need for the gloves, ID tags, of course. And then the rest of this pretty much is ruled out for you guys. Do you guys ever go anywhere that you need to deal with CBR gear and have to lug that crud along with you?
Negative.
Okay, good. We can skip that one then. Perfect. So really what ALSS comes down to is do you, even in transport from time to time, anti-exposure suits, have you guys had to go anywhere that required the carry of anti-exposure suits? Or have you managed to dodge that?
Not that I know of.
Nice. Okay, good. So I can blow past this. Now, I presume you're carrying the 149 in the aircraft, not C-cell?
I believe we carry C-cell when we're on our DET deployment overseas.
Yep, that sounds accurate. And then home CONUS, you should be using the 149. So realistically, with the 149, what this picture doesn't show real well, right above this dial is going to be a pin that you will pull out. That way you can push in on the dial and rotate it to the various frequency settings. Don't have a good picture of the front to show you, but there's basically 3 LED lights that, based on what is flashing, tells you what's going on. But on the back, it kind of walks the dog for you to where, hey, if I'm in GPS, I get blink B, which is it's on for half a second and off while it's acquiring, and then it will stay on once it's acquired the GPS. If I've put it in AM1, then I'm going to be in 243. If I'm in AM2, it's going to be 2828. AM3, both AM1 and AM2 light goes on, so 2 of the LEDs, and that puts me in 121.5. And then if I'm beacon, it will blink S for triple beacon, so 2 seconds on, 4 seconds off. But if I've got it in 406 only, it'll blink L, which is 2 and 8, just for the on-off, just to kind of give you an idea of what it's doing. So you've got up above telling you which frequencies and so forth for how long they last. Generally speaking, if it's a rescue scenario, start with the beacon because it's just slow and steady sending out data until you get aircraft closer, and then you cycle to the AM voices, or you set up a radio plan that every so often you're going to check it, however the general team decides to deal with that. Which raft do you guys have? What's the capacity for that sucker when you guys shove it out? Does anybody know?
I know we were equipped with the 65-pound raft, the Winslow one, but I don't know the actual capacity off the top of it.
Gotcha. Okay. I'll try and look that up and get back to you. But you said it's a 65-pound? All right.
Yes.
In theory, they all should have the same basic premise. Every one of them that I'm aware of has an upper and lower tube, insulated floor. It's kind of a white insulated floor. You'll have a hand pump to be able to kind of adjust the amount of inflation pressure as needed. And it depends on the raft whether you have the overhead canopy, rain collection, all that stuff. But really, the basic premise is I've got flotation, I've got a way to board it, and then I have this stabilizer here, which is the C anchor, that you try and line it to where it is matching. If you're on a peak of a wave, the stabilizer is in the peak of the wave next to you. So it kind of pulls you and doesn't do a major offset where it's in a trough while you're on a peak, because then it'll try and flip the raft, is the general premise. So just depending on whether it's one or some rafts are set up with multiple. There's usually lanyards around that you can connect to. So if you had to get in the water to cool off, you could clip yourself to it or hold on for reboarding after, et cetera, et cetera. So there's multiple ways to do it. But there's generally always, when I push that sucker out, there's going to be, without, I was about to say without fail, but I have yet to see one that doesn't have some sort of D ring that you yank to activate the raft and get it inflated. Finally, with lasers, bear in mind, almost all DoD lasers that we use for tactical purposes are generally a Class B and Class 4. This particular one has a wavelength of 808 to 860, which, for reminder purposes, naked eye sees from 400 to 700 nanometers. So this one would not be seen by the naked eye. Goggles, MVGs, are 600 to 900. So goggles will see this, and that's why we'll use it, is from a tactical advantage, we can see it. Some of the others available out there, this 3R, visible wavelength, but it's IR aim or illuminator mode, can't be seen. So does anybody happen to bring that crud on board? Did they secure it, turn it off properly so it's not flashing around the aircraft, is really what you're concerned with. And again, less concerned with you guys than I would be like a C-130 Class 4 aircraft as well, that might see more of these. But ultimately, 3B and 4 are the main problem children for us for damage to the human body. And unfortunately, there are those types of lasers that are available on the market. I need to be worried about the 400 to 1400 nanometer wavelengths, because that can damage various parts of the eye depending on what wavelength. So therein lies the problem of some idiot that buys a very powerful laser off the internet, thinks it's funny to flash it at aircraft off of his patio on his apartment, at aircraft that are on short final, because then I get kind of a flashing effect. So for you on the receiving end, turn away from it in terms of your head. If you're able to turn the aircraft, all the better, but I realize on short final that would be a luxury that's hard to come by. Don your laser eye protection, your LEP, if you have it. Big thing's going to be letting ATC know, give them as much data as you possibly can. Where do you feel like it came from? Can you discern a color? When? Avoid rubbing your eyes, because just because you don't feel pain doesn't mean injury couldn't have occurred. Let the ODO know, because there's two reports that need to go up. One is a generalized flash report, and then the other is the FAA report. And then depending on damage or not, then we're dealing with, do I need to do a mishap report? could be triggered if it was a bad enough situation. But the big thing is get to optometry or ophthalmology as soon as they can, just because, again, just because you don't feel something different or don't see something different doesn't mean something couldn't have occurred that they might be able to help mitigate and solve for you. If you have LEP, just making sure it's in good physical condition. The pubs have a lot of gouge on how bad things can be and still be considered RFI. It's more than you might think, so they're pretty robust pieces of gear. A bunch of different styles out there nowadays make it a little easier and more useful to wear. Big thing's going to be, should you have an event? And I've heard of them all over the country, from Texas, California. I want to say Oceania might have had it at one point. I think Whidbey's managed to avoid it, but maybe not. I don't know about the DC area and up in that neck of the world whether anybody's been dumb enough to do it. Big thing is call Tri-Service Hotline. They can help walk the dog for you should you happen to have an event. Kept it under 50 minutes, but any questions, comments, concerns?